Thank you to all the members for supporting my channel. Jesus, my voice never does what I want it to do. Hi there. I've had to re-record this video 3 times because things keep messing up, so I apologize if I misspeak because I'm already, disoriented, to put it mildly. I like talking about power creep a lot. It's pretty obvious if you look at my channel because I've mentioned it about maybe 3 or 4 times in the past 9 uploads, but that's alright because I know you like hearing about it and I like talking about it, so it's a win-win. And while I will admit it is a little frustrating when I get this new limited time shiny character and they're considered weak a couple patches later, it's even less frustrating than it would be if it were something like, I don't know, sustained power creep, which is something that is incredibly horrible and I don't really see anybody talk about it. You could say that healer power creep isn't sustainable. I'm sorry. It's really easy to get wrapped up in how your new shiny toy is no longer as shiny as it used to be, but what's not really that easy to notice is when the characters you're using to sustain the shiny toy start to get a little dull over time. So let's make a comparison to a couple of games, why don't we? All know about Genshin Impact, obviously, you all play this game. Well, in Genshin Impact we have this little cool character named Bennett, and Bennett is a meta-defining unit that has been overpowered for a very, very, very long time. And the reason why Bennett is so overpowered is because he's a healer character that also buffs the team's attack by a very considerable amount, making him both a sustained character as well as an amplification character for other teams. For the longest time throughout Genshin Impact's history, Bennett has been so ridiculously overpowered that he was a mainstay on pretty much every team throughout the game, because, well, it's really hard to say no to a character that buffs your attack by 50%, especially considering even the highest DPS characters that hardcore scale of attack were only getting around 2.2k, and Bennett could increase that by 1.1k, assuming max benefits. On top of that, he could heal you with the use of his elemental burst, and you could also build him on Noblesse Oblige for an additional 20% attack bonus, making Bennett a very, very strong character that dominated pretty much the entire healer slot for a really long time. And that's understandable because miHoYo was very clearly hesitant on making new powerful healer characters because how are you gonna make something better than Bennett? And in open freeform combat, it makes sense that Bennett does the things he does because you could realistically just not get hit. And then at what point is having a healer even viable then? Therefore, the healer needs to do something else in order to be useful, but miHoYo was scared to do that for a very long time. It wasn't until around the release of Sumeru, actually, when we finally got access to Baiju, who was a healer that tanked while also buffing damage with the form of buffing bloom reactions. Some people would say that he power crept healers, and he did. And then we got access to Furina, who is both a healer and off-field damage dealer, and she has one of the best buffs in the entire game. So is that sustained power creep like I was talking about at the beginning of the video? No, it's not. Because these characters aren't powerful because they heal more than the other character, they're powerful because they deal additional bonuses outside of their core healing. If you want a real example of what I'm talking about, then we need to look no further than the Sauvignon of power creep, Stariel. Yeah, you remember when I made that community post the other day and I was like, would y'all watch a video on Stariel? And a bunch of you in the comments were like, oh man, yeah, I wouldn't click on a video, I don't care about Stariel. Yeah, we clicked on this one, didn't you? On Stariel's release, there were a couple healers that were the main characters of note that people would point to when they were referring to sustained type units. There was, of course, the free option that everybody had access to in the form of Natasha and March 7th, and March 7th's shield isn't really that good of a sustain, so we're gonna leave her out of the equation, because quite frankly, I don't think she should be in the same topic as the other characters because she's more of a damage dealer. So that leaves us with Natasha, and I'm going to say this right now. Natasha on release was okay. With the tap of her skill, she could heal a single target of your choosing that would restore a, I don't want to say good, a okay amount of health. You know, she'd restore about 1/3 of the character's health, and then with the tap of her elemental burst, she will restore about 2/3 of the team's health to the entire team. Assuming you had a well-built, high ER Natasha, you would get her healing burst back once every 2 or 3 turns, depending on how often she was abused by the enemies, which, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it like this. it was barely enough on the game's release. We also got access to characters like Jerpard and Bailu, who were 5 stars. Bailu is still okay to this day. She doesn't really have a cleanse on her skill, and her skill is kinda RNG based, but she does have a revive in her kit, meaning if one of your characters die, it's really not that big of a deal, because she can just bring you back. And then there's Jerpard, who with the cast of his burst would set up a team-wide shield of ice and snow around your team, giving them roughly half a health bar worth of shield, and his shield was actually pretty good. It was kinda hard to get his burst back up off cooldown so you can maintain 100% shield uptime, but all things considered, it's pretty fucking strong. However, like I said in a recent video, if there's anything that Star Rail has, it is power creep, alright? Power creep and Star Rail go together like cheese and crackers. They are inseparable from one another. Peanut butter and jelly, they just go together. And unfortunately, there's really no way to separate that from all aspects of the game, including sustained power creep, which is a very, very painful experience because unfortunately, as new characters release in Star Rail, other characters release in question to make them more powerful or weaker. For example, when Firefly released, they would release a character like, oh, I don't know, the Puppets, which were incredibly weak to break. And when they released a character like, I don't know, Avengerine, they would release characters that required you to have a shield. The monkey enemies whose attacks are reflected by shields and Sam, who drains so much HP you might as well have a shield instead, are two enemies that immediately come to mind. These on their own aren't bad things. They're enemies that encourage you to pull new characters, which can be a little bit annoying if you don't have said character, but the problem comes in a term where a lot of modern enemies for Star Rail are heavily scaled around the newest, shiniest sustain. Going back to Avengerine, Avengerine cast a Jerpard level shield with the press of his skill, which means he can get it 3 times quicker than Jerpard can, and he does debuffs, okay? Jerpard, in order to keep up, would need to get his burst back off of every single cooldown, and that is impossible, which means Avengerine is so much stronger than every other sustain that he just makes them all irrelevant. And because Avengerine is so strong, the developers have to do what? Well, they have to power creep the enemies, because you can't have Avengerine being so incredibly ridiculously overpowered that every other enemy in the game isn't able to keep up, because at that point having Avengerine would just be a guaranteed win no matter how weak your DPS is, so they end up increasing the damage of the new enemies that release over time. But this retroactively makes every other healer worthless. And the reason for this is because healers, simply put, cannot keep up with the new DPS that the enemies are pushing out. Some of you who are unfortunate enough to have to go through Penacony with day 1 healers probably experienced this firsthand, and I would know, because I did too. The damage that these enemies were pumping out, these normal overworld enemies, was so high that I had to bring in 2 healers in the form of Natasha and Lynx, which means in turn I had to cut down my damage by a lot, making pretty much every single encounter with an enemy outside of, well, normal trash mobs was just an absolute nightmare. And this was before Avengerine released. After Avengerine released, the DPS on enemies has been getting, quite frankly, ridiculous, and I can even draw a comparison to other limited time 5 stars. For example, Fu Xuan. You see, Fu Xuan is not a healer in the typical sense. She is more of a sustaining class. In order to get her healing, she needs to build up a lot of HP, at which point she will reflect realities, mirror back the damage, and spread out an equal amount of HP throughout your team, essentially bringing everything back to 0. And in order for Fu Xuan to do this, she needs to first take away HP from her own pool, which usually isn't that big of a deal because you're heavily building into health on Fu Xuan. But you see, here's the funny thing. Fu Xuan was a very early unit in Star Rail's history, and over time, as enemies start doing more damage, her reversing reality to heal, quite simply, isn't becoming enough anymore. It's getting to the point where Fu Xuan's healing and her sustainability is getting outclassed by enemies who just deal so much damage that her reversing time isn't enough to maintain your health anymore. And this, by the way, is a premium limited time 5-star. And this is a big problem because effectively they cannot release a new sustained character because they will in turn have to make them better than the other characters, because that's what MiHoYo does. That's what Star Rail does. And if they make the new sustains better than the old sustains, then they sustain too much, which means they need to go back and make more powerful enemies and increase the damage modifiers. But the more they do that, the more of the older units who are the default sustains become irrelevant. A new player starting out today will have a very hard time going through the story mode with Lynx and Natasha because quite frankly their healing just isn't enough anymore. That is sustain creep. Characters that do their job before quite simply just aren't cutting it anymore. And this isn't something like DPS where you feel bad because your new shiny toy is only doing a quarter of the HP as another one would do. No, this is worse because this means you cannot fight normal trash enemies if sustain creep becomes too much. So to all of you complaining that preservation and healing characters haven't gotten a new release in a very long time, just know that I'm happy it's that way. I hope it stays that way, because if it doesn't, we're in for some shit in the future. That all being said, like, comment, subscribe. See ya.